Well, welcome class. My name is Jerry Fankhauser, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Florida Agricultural Experiment Station here at the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. I also have this other gig in my life, and that's called the Lead Oversight Manager for the University of Florida IFAS Hemp Pilot Project. And so how did I get this particular position thrust upon me as an Assistant Director of the Research Mission at the University of Florida? Well, it goes back to my background and what we do here in the experiment station. So here within IFAS, we have a dean and director of the Agricultural Experiment Station, Dr. Rob Gilbert. He was initially the lead oversight manager for the pilot project, but then he transitioned from agronomy chair to the dean of research for IFAS. And so then I was tabbed as the lead oversight manager, and that was back in late 2018 going into 2019. So how did I get to be an assistant director of an experiment station? Well, it's not everything you think of when you're going through high school and college and say, I'm going to grow up and be a research administrator, but my experience lends itself well to where I'm at today. My experience has been growing up in Indiana, and if you're involved in agriculture in the state of Indiana, you go to Purdue University, the Indiana Land Grant. I obtained 2 degrees at Purdue University and then became manager of 2 outlying research stations. Row crop research, some specialty crop research, but predominantly corn and soybeans and some specialty crops up near the Chicagoland area. I did go to industry, and I encourage that type of experience for anyone that's looking to learn more about a for-profit type mentality and environment. It was very exciting 2 years. I worked in Northern Ohio for American Cyanamid. They provide crop protection products like weed control products. And that was the time way back then, and Dr. Roca would know this, when Roundup Ready technology was emerging on the market. So it was a very exciting time for weed control, especially in the corn, soybean, and cotton markets, and enjoyed my 2 years working for American Cyanamid, which no longer exists as a company. I did come back to Purdue in 1997 and then managed the entire 8 outlying farm system for 17 years before I came to the University of Florida. And so being the lead oversight manager for the hemp pilot project means doing a number of things. And part of that is overall education, whether I'm visiting with growers or even talking to my family back up in Indiana. And when people say they want to grow hemp, we say our first response back is, what do you want to grow? Because hemp production is quite varied. You have 3 predominant types of hemp: cannabis sativa, the same species of plant that you all have been dealing with medical marijuana. But on the hemp side, the 0.3% total delta-9 THC or less, you have the fiber, grain, and the cannabinoid, high cannabinoid flower type hemp production. And people talk about CBD, and now CBG interest is emerging. And that is probably 80% of the calls we get, the email correspondence, and the money that's been put into research and the industry that's emerging in Florida at present. Since you all have been talking about medical marijuana, you may be somewhat familiar or very familiar with what cannabinoids are. But cannabinoids, simply put, are biologically active compounds in cannabis sativa. And over 110 have been identified, but theoretically there may be closer to 200. And they are biologically active. We do see medical benefits. There is at least 1 drug that has been approved by FDA for epilepsy. So we know there's defined benefits, but people swear it helps them with ailments, helps their dogs, helps their cats, a number of claims, but the science, the new knowledge that is desperately needed is still lacking. And our School of Medicine here at the University of Florida and School of Pharmacy are now involved in cannabis research on the hemp side, and also to a certain extent on the higher THC side, although very limited. So THC is the main psychoactive component in the plant, and that's what you've been talking about on the medical marijuana side here in the state of Florida. The predominant form is the acidic form that heat and light will rapidly convert to the neutral psychoactive form. And so USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, and the resulting state laws and rules, which here in Florida is from FDAC, the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, defines total potential THC is that of the acidic form plus the natural concentration combined with that calculation, and the total must be below 0.35% on a dry weight basis to be considered hemp and not marijuana. And so we deal on the hemp side as a pilot project. The medical marijuana and recreational marijuana in other states deal on the cannabis sativa high THC side. Now here in the state, you've been talking about medical marijuana, which is regulated by the Department of Health. Everything we do under the hemp pilot project statute, whether federally or within the state of Florida, comes from Department of Agricultural guidance and rulemaking. And so two different agencies, interestingly enough, providing rules and regulating the same plant. It's very interesting. It can be problematic at times, and I'll try to touch on that later through my talk. And so what is a hemp pilot project, and how did we get to this point here in the state of Florida? Previously in other states that had pilot projects as far back as 2014, 2015. It's an interesting story, and it all began with the 2014 U.S. Farm Bill. And in that particular Farm Bill at the federal level, there was language and resulting rules that allowed universities and state departments of agriculture to initiate and conduct a pilot project. And the idea was to begin to better understand the science and the production of low THC cannabis sativa. Some states like Kentucky, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Indiana got going right away through their state houses. Legislators enacted rules that allowed their state departments of agriculture to begin to give out permits. Now, these are research permits, even though growers had access in certain states to these permits. Those early opportunities to grow hemp on a commercial scale often resulted in an opportunity to fail because you're dealing with a crop that has been illegal since the 1930s. Unlike corn, soybeans, cotton, and peanuts that have had years of breeding and commercialization efforts, there was not much knowledge known about how to produce hemp, grain and fiber hemp, high CBD, CBG hemp. And so everybody was learning on the go. And that's okay if you're learning on the go with someone else's money. But when you're learning on the go, trying to make a profit and you lose a crop, it can be very expensive, especially on the high cannabinoid side of hemp production, trying to produce those flowers for CBD or CBG production. So in 2017, the state of Florida, up in Tallahassee, the legislators enacted statute that allowed the land-grant institutions in the state of Florida to conduct research, to initiate a pilot project effort. Now this excluded other state universities like Florida Gulf Coast from getting going with a pilot project. And one can go back and try to understand why the particular statute was what it was, but I think the issue was trying to limit the access and to slowly understand the knowledge and opportunities for cannabis sativa in the state of Florida. So the University of Florida took the route of trying to work with industry to secure funding because we couldn't get Board of Trustee approval here at the university until we had funding. The great thing about this legislation from a tax standpoint is they gave us no money to do a pilot project, but they gave us the authority. So we had to find industry funding to get that accomplished. We only have 2 years to conduct the initial pilot project. We began in 2019 formally. We have to finish up and report back to Governor DeSantis and state legislators here in the spring or summer of 2021. So we're well into our second year of hemp research at this point. Our initial response, like I said, was to engage with industry, and we went to our Board of Trustees and said hemp production will be limited to University of Florida facilities. This was because of legalities and liability that this particular course of action was pursued. Genetics would be looked at through variety trials without breeding efforts. We were going to basically look at what's out there and see if it can be adapted to the state of Florida. We would also look at processing and market research without any product sales. So essentially, everything we produce would be crop destroyed, not moved into the commercial channel of trade. So our overall goal and what we presented to university leadership back in late 2018, was to initiate a UF-IFAS hemp pilot project to support the future viability and sustainability of an industrial hemp industry. We were going to do this in an open and transparent fashion. In other words, our science, any new knowledge we came upon through our research efforts would be communicated to all stakeholders, to all of those in the industry looking to move to Florida or ramp up their efforts to sell plants, to sell CBD in the state of Florida. So our initial plan, as far as the details, was to secure industry funding and conduct this research at IFAS facilities with a multidisciplinary team within IFAS and even within our pharmacology school. And our three overarching objectives were to identify hemp varieties suitable for planting in Florida, develop hemp management practices and cropping systems economically viable for use in Florida, and then this other issue that I need to touch on, and it was outlined in state statute, and that was to assess hemp invasion risk in Florida's natural and built environments. Why that particular bullet point is important was that it was outlined in state statute back in 2017. And growing up in Indiana, and many of our ditches around where I grew up in rural Indiana, we still had wild ditchweed. That was hemp that was grown 70, 80, 90 years ago. And so we know in the Northern Corn Belt in the United States that hemp is invasive. It's not overly invasive. It doesn't take over fields, but it does persist. The seeds will regenerate, grow, and ditchweed is found. The funny thing about that, which you all may get a kick out of, is none of the country kids ever smoked this ditchweed because it was low THC. And so about the only thing you would see is maybe a city kid or two take some of this and end up with a terrible headache trying to get any benefit from what we call ditchweed up north. And the fourth objective that came on later with our pilot project was to work closely with our other mission here at the Land Grant Institution, the University of Florida, and that's to work with IFAS Extension to provide production-oriented information to all Florida growers that want to produce hemp. This is that transfer knowledge that the Land Grant Institution is mandated to do, and it was important because we just didn't have hemp production information for Southeast United States, specifically Florida. I can tell you, and I can go online and tell you much more about how to grow hemp in Southern Indiana or Kentucky or North Carolina, but how you raise hemp in Indiana is going to be different than how we are going to grow hemp in the state of Florida. Sponsorship. Research takes money, whether you're at Florida Gulf Coast or at the University of Florida. And statute was clear. We had to go out and find funding. Luckily, there was a CBD company called Green Roads that offered to formally sponsor our research at the tune of $1.3 million. Once that research contract was firmed up, we were able to go in front of our Board of Trustees for approval and get a letter from our Board of Trustees, which we then took back to the State Department of Agriculture, and that allowed us to be issued pilot project permits. We used those objectives that I mentioned on the last slides, and we're very clear to our Board of Trustees about what we were trying to accomplish. The interesting thing is a lot of people got behind what we were trying to do, and we've secured over $250,000 in not only in-kind donations, free seed and hemp plants, but also money, kind of like the Bernie Sanders of hemp pilot projects. Some people wrote $20 checks, some people wrote $50 checks. Some companies wrote $30,000 checks. And it took all this money to ramp up this research. So it was very important on top of the $1.3 million, which allowed us to build fencing, to purchase seed, to get graduate students, which are key to doing field and controlled growth type research efforts for a project of this scale. The pilot project hemp team within IFAS included our lead scientist, Dr. Zach Brim, who's an agronomist, and he's down at the Tropical Research and Education Center. I'm the lead oversight manager. I'm responsible for all the permitting and plant movement logistics. In fact, I'll be moving plants from Alva, Florida, which is near Immokalee, down in your part of the world, up to Apopka tomorrow. So we routinely move plants around the state. We do that with our permits, and it allows us to stay on the right side of the law. And that's part of my job too, is to keep all these fine people at the bottom of this particular slide out of jail. And that's an important thing, because we're still dealing with a controlled agricultural commodity, which was deemed in the 2018 Farm Bill and signed by President Trump. Even though we have an agricultural commodity now, like peanuts, like cotton, like soybeans, it is still going to be a permitted and regulated crop because of its cousin, the same species, marijuana. And so looking at the bottom of the screen, we have Luke Flory, who's our specialist in invasive risk. He's going to be looking at how hemp might persist and escape here in the state of Florida. Dr. Josh Freeman up in North Florida, Quincy, up near the Panhandle there, looking at high CBD hemp production. Dr. Gilly Evans heads up the Tropical Research and Education Center. He's an expert in economics, so he's doing the market research. Mike Mulvaney is out there in the Western Panhandle at our West Florida location. He's looking at nutrient and water quality issues related to hemp production. And some of that research has been affected by Hurricane Sally that rolled through a couple weeks ago. Again, another challenging situation when you try to produce crops in the state of Florida. And where I'll be tomorrow at the Mid-Florida Research and Education Center, that's where we initially started indoor controlled growth research, photoperiod research at that Apopka location. So again, an amazing effort to ramp up with only a year and a half of time into a pilot project effort. We not only got over 40 state research pilot project permits, but we have a Schedule I DEA registration, and that allows us to do a lot more in terms of flexibility with our medical school. And when we run hot with samples, and when we say hot, you probably know that I'm talking running in excess of 0.35% total THC in our research, we can maintain those plants because they're going to be in a crop destruct situation. So that DEA registration, that Schedule I authority, does give us a lot more flexibility with our 20 faculty at some level to be engaged with hemp research across the state. And you'll see that that research is in the Tampa area, down in the tropics at our Tropical Research and Education Center. We're on the muck in the lighter sands near Belglade at the south end of Lake Okeechobee. We're doing work all around the Gainesville campus up in Alachua County, and then out in the Panhandle at 2 locations, Quincy, and then that J in far western Florida. Look at the different schools and departments within IFAS, and you'll see a breadth of expertise, whether it's plant pathology, on the economic side, environmental horticulture, horticultural sciences. And so in some disciplines, it's hard to define where hemp fits. Some look at it as a horticultural crop, but at the field level, others look at it as an agronomical type crop, which in Canada, when you look at grain and fiber production, it does look more like an agronomic crop, biomass production, forage production. So it's just a truly unique species of plant with many different uses, and grows and develops quite differently depending on how you manage it culturally. So early issues with hemp production. These were issues we went into knowing, and we have since learned. Early on, importing seed from around the world was a very challenging issue. We had loads of seed being rejected at the Canadian border. Most of those issues are gone now, but transportation is still an issue. And without proper documentation, any shipment that's pulled by DEA will be viewed as marijuana until you can prove otherwise. And so it's very important as we ship our material across state lines or bring it into the state, that we make sure that the proper documentation, our IFAS documentation, is in there, all the permits. And if you're involved in any of this currently or down the road, make sure that documentation is at the forefront of your mind, because we are dealing still with a regulated agricultural commodity. THC testing in hop plants. Again, this is a challenging issue. A grower might invest thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars in a crop. But if it tests hot at the end of its production cycle, what that grower has is nothing more than a field or a greenhouse full of marijuana, which if they're not appropriately licensed on the Board of Health side, Department of Health, that crop will be destroyed. Biosecurity and invasion potential, trying to keep that crop where you grew it, trying to not have escapes come up in the following crop, whether it's in a field of peanuts or a field of sugarcane. This is something we're looking at on the research side. The lack of registered crop protection products to control pests. This is a real issue with hemp production, especially at the field level. There are products available, and FDACS in the state of Florida does have a list, but when you look at that list, most of them are bioherbicides. They're used on the medical marijuana side, and so many of those commercially available products we're used to with other crops, atrazine, other products that you may or may not be familiar with, they're not available for use with industrial hemp. And so we're trying to do that off-label, what we call off-the-label type work, trying to increase that knowledge in case these companies decide to pursue registration of their products for cannabis sativa on the hemp side. You also have this issue of personal security, theft, and law enforcement. I routinely haul plants around the state of Florida. I can at times smell like I've been at a fraternity party all weekend. That can be a real problem. You definitely want to shower and not wear your work boots when you go to church on Sunday. You will smell because of the terpene load like you've been around medical marijuana or recreational marijuana. And so it's a little startling for some when you're in that fast food line at the store, and this has happened to me. You just have to explain the situation. I think the funniest story I can tell you all in your class is I came from the Everglades Research Station about 6-8 months ago with a bunch of plants, dropped them off in Alva, and then went to a Beef Cattle Association annual convention. And I did not realize that was valet parking only. The problem with valet parking is you have to hand your keys over to a young gentleman that's going to take your vehicle, which now smells terribly like you've been smoking all the way from Belglade to Marco Island, which is where I was at. So that can be a real issue. Again, you got to have documentation. We carry all of our permitting in glove boxes, and anyone involved in this type of research should always carry their documentation on them. You also have the issue of theft. We've had some gates compromised. We have not identified any loss of plants, but we think that threat is always out there. And if you're close to harvest on acres of high cannabinoid type CBD hemp production, that threat will be there because you can typically smell it downwind for at least a mile, mile and a half on a given day. And so the neighbors, people in town, they're going to become aware of your operation. We use cameras. Some we identify and some we don't. And that helps, I think, to a certain extent, at least identify who's out there in the field looking at your plants. And so the unknowns in the state of Florida included adapted varieties and cultivars, cropping systems. What are the economics of hemp production and the available markets here in the state of Florida and beyond? And what are the environmental impacts, the invasiveness, like I've touched on already? And so when we got going with our hemp pilot project, we tried to secure seed and plant material from all over the world, whether it was from southern China, which is about the same latitude as our panhandle of Florida, or Italy, other parts of Europe, and the United States and Canada. Most of what came in to us in the United States was on the high CBD side, coming from California and states like Colorado also. The diversity in this type of plant is highlighted in this photo on this slide. You'll see the variance in seed size, whether you're dealing with grain and fiber or high cannabinoid type hemp. Very small seed, and at one point on the CBD hemp side of production, one seed was costing $3 to $5. It's now down to around 75 cents, even as low as 50 cents per seed for a cannabinoid hemp type seed. And this is typically feminized seed, female hemp seed. So why is hemp variety cultivar adaptability so important in the state of Florida? Well, we're talking a lot about here is outdoor production. And when you're talking about agronomic production in the field, whether it's peanuts in North Florida or hemp down near Fort Myers, you got to talk about performance. And I give the analogy because my son played college baseball, a performance on the field or in the field. Tools. When a grower looks at purchasing hemp plants or hemp seed, they need to look at the agronomic tools. And when you're trying to recruit a baseball kid out of high school, you're looking at 5 tools in particular, and that's speed, power, hitting for average, arm strength, and fielding. I don't care if you're talking about Major League Baseball or even high school baseball. This is what coaches, this is what recruiters are looking at. So for us as scientists at the University of Florida and consultants in the state of Florida and producers, when we're seeking productive hemp, cultivars and varieties that may fit on our farm, growers should be looking for at least these 5 tools: low and stable total THC, seed or plant vigor and viability, the ability to germinate and grow in the field or in the greenhouse, and day length and photoperiod appropriate. Because cannabis sativa, for the most part, is a day length sensitive plant. And that means it is the length of night that determines how long cannabis will grow vegetatively and when it will begin to flower. And so we commonly say hemp is a short day plant, or medical marijuana is a short day plant. And if you've been talking about medical marijuana production, you may have learned that many of these operations, these MMTCs in the state of Florida, early on run 18 to 20 hours of supplemental light or natural day length in greenhouses to get that adequate vegetative growth. And then they kick back those artificial lights and let the female cannabis plants flower so they can get numerous flowers on those plants, which is where they derive that high THC concentration. Pest resistance. Just like any other commodity, there are just hundreds of things that can ruin cannabis sativa crop, either in the greenhouse on the medical marijuana side or in the field on the hemp side. Diseases, insects, nematodes, and we have plenty of nematodes in our sandy soils here in the state of Florida. And ultimately, the growers in the business to produce a crop that will yield and provide a profit margin. And so the hemp production, this particular cultivar or variety selected, has to produce adequate amounts of cannabinoid, CBD, or grain and or fiber for the market that the grower is seeking to make a profit on. So what I have for the most part now is results from 2019, because we're just getting data now out of the field here in 2020. But the hemp genetics that we looked at in the field last year at these locations, North Florida Research and Education Center at Quincy, our forage unit at Hague, the Everglades Research and Education Center at Belglade at the south end of Lake Okeechobee, and our Trek location at Homestead down in that nearly tropical environment, we looked at 30 plus hemp varieties from seed and also cuttings that were transplanted to the field. Uses, all 3 uses, fiber, grain, and high cannabinoid. And the origins were across the globe, North America, Europe, and Asia. The research focus, cultivar screening, planting date. Planting date is going to be critical, and I can't reinforce that enough at the field level. Because unlike Canada, we do not see 16 and a half hours, 15 and a half hours of day length on June 20th. Here in Florida, down near Homestead, down near Miami, we hardly get to 14 hours of day length on June 20th each year. So our planting dates need to be fine-tuned to allow these different varieties of cannabis sativa on the hemp side to grow, develop, and then begin to flower as those days shorten up as the summer moves on. The other issue at the field level is seed emergence. Do we have seed that is commercially viable? Does it emerge well? And will it produce? And how are those CBD, and more importantly, from a legal standpoint, those THC levels as that plant grows and develops? Because if you're doing testing in the field and you have high cannabinoid hemp out there, and once you hit that 0.35%, DEA considers that field of hemp now marijuana, and that crop has to be destroyed, or retesting needs to be done as soon as possible, obviously, to confirm that that field, that particular lot of hemp production is running hot. And so moving around the state, let's go to our Tropical Research and Education Center back in 2019. The interesting thing that we saw at that location was how the South Chinese grain and fiber varieties performed very well. And that was to be expected. With the proper planting date, there was adequate growth and development. You can see in the rear of this particular slide in this photograph, plants that are dark green and 2 to 3 foot above those plants in the front, which were the European-derived grain and fiber varieties. Those European varieties just did not perform at this South Florida location. The short day length, the combination of that with the heat and humidity may have just stressed these plants to the point of ceasing vegetative growth and trying to finish up and senesce, as we say. In other words, end the viable growth early. You can see the yellowing of the leaves and some of those emerged flowers with these plants. Moving to Gulf Coast Research and Education Center, and that's in eastern Hillsborough County, due east of Tampa, we did some interesting field and greenhouse trials. On the greenhouse side, we have a researcher there, actually 2 researchers, that were looking at both pathology issues, whether it's blight or some other disease, and also nematode pressure with the different cultivars and varieties of hemp that we had. Many of the results were not significantly different, but it was good that we took a first look at this information because we had no such knowledge of nematodes in the state of Florida and how they would persist and flourish on some of these different species of cannabis sativa. There is one particular variety of high CBD hemp called wife, and there's many different variations of that particular biotype or cultivar across the country. But there's some evidence in literature that wife may have more resistance to nematode pressure. And we wanted to look at that, and we're currently doing some trials with that particular biotype or cultivar of high CBD hemp. The other slide is an interesting study that we engaged in. It was kind of an opportunistic study because this is not actually a hemp growing field. This is a hop yard. And so hops is a short day plant. Just like cannabis sativa. And to grow hops successfully in the state of Florida, because of the lack of day length, we can do so, but you have to have supplemental lighting. So what you see in this hop yard are 15 to 18 foot poles and lights on top of those poles. And in that hop yard, we can get tremendous hop growth and development. And then we want those flowers or cones to develop on those hops. We just turn those lights off at night and we will get cone development. And from that, you get something that I'm sure none of you have ever touched, but that's wonderful Florida brew beer that I think it's Three Daughters in Tampa has been producing with these hops. And so it's an amazing story. What we have to do is find some day length neutral or adapted hops that will grow without supplemental lighting. And the same thing is true for cannabis sativa, because in this particular photograph, you're looking at plants that were transplanted to the field in early September. Days are getting shorter, but we're using supplemental lighting to keep these plants growing vegetatively, non-flowering, just like you would on the medical marijuana side in a greenhouse. We took the same plants and replicated this trial right here about 500 feet down the field without lights. And we wanted to show over 1,000 attendees at the 2019 Florida Ag Expo the difference in growth and development in the fall with supplemental lighting and without supplemental lighting. And the results were dramatic. I don't have that because it's not published yet, but it was 5 to 10 times the biomass growth difference between supplemental lighting and natural day length lighting in the fall, and that's October, November in the state of Florida in that Tampa, Hillsborough area. And so growers hopefully saw that, and the take-home message hit home that you can grow hemp in the state of Florida, but you got to understand the effects of day length. And the data planning is going to be critical unless you have a day length neutral type hemp cultivar that you can grow in your production system. Moving up to the north end of the state, this was a rather tremendously successful research effort by Dr. Josh Freeman at Quincy. He transplanted high CBD hemp cultivars in late June, early July in the field. And this showed us that in that more temperate environment in North Florida, that cannabis sativa, low THC hemp transplanted to the field in plasticulture, in other words, with raised beds, white plastic, drip line, feeding irrigation and fertilizer and recommended dosages to these plants will work. This production system worked well. Some of these high CBD hemp plants were big enough that from a distance you could have thrown lights on them and they would have looked like Christmas trees from the road. They were that productive, and it was impressive. What was not impressive is what I'm going to show you right here on this slide, was the fact that as CBD concentration rose, so did THC. And so what we had at this study under the leadership of Dr. Josh Freeman was 3 cultivars of more traditional high CBD hemp, cherry blossom, cherry times T1, and cherry wine. But then we also had 2 day-length neutral cultivars provided to us from Keogene, a company in California. Day-length neutral, so they'll grow and develop on their own time and then flower when they hit a natural trigger. And it's an interesting plant. It's more of a dwarf type growth, so you're not going to see that very bushy, tall growth. But we wanted that kind of day-length neutral versus photoperiod sensitive type growth. In the upper left graph, you'll see total potential THC and weeks after the initiation of flowering. What you see there with the 3 CBD hemp cultivars that were photoperiod sensitive is that we were above the legal limit and stayed above it with all 3. So these 3 grew and developed well, but ran hot. And that, what you have there, my students, is in the eyes of DEA, marijuana. And that cannot be marketed and sold. When you look at total potential THC with the day-length neutral Keogene cultivars, interestingly enough, about 5 weeks after the initiation of flowering, they too were running hot. But if you took it on towards natural senescence in the field, it actually dropped back below the legal limit. So that's an interesting type distribution of THC concentration with the autoflowering. This is important research to do because we need to understand what's happening in a Florida environment with these type of genetics. Now let's look at the CBD development on the lower 2 tables. Total potential CBD, weeks after initiation of flowering, very respectable. Anything above 6-7% CBD as a percentage in the plant, mostly in the flower material, is impressive. And the, I think it was the cherry times T1 ran as high as 12% CBD expression as a function of dry weight. Looking at the autoflowering, GMT201013, GMT20201012, they were much lower, running 6 to 8%, which is still considered, at least it was in the state of Kentucky, very impressive and economically profitable, at least in 2015, 2016, under those economics. And so the take-home message here is we're learning. We're taking a snapshot with these 5 different types of genetics, 3 day-length sensitive, 2 auto-flowering. We're tracking cannabinoid development, and we're finding that in our environment, and this has been seen even up north, that you can run hot with these high CBD type genetics. And that should be very concerning to producers. Moving indoors in Central Florida, we did initiate work at our Mid-Florida Research and Education Center, looking at strictly CBD hemp genetics, photoperiod studies, pest studies, because we have a very well-established entomologist at that location. Very good information and some fact sheets we've been able to generate out of that research. Again, at North Florida, we were looking at field level propagation and greenhouse pests, as I showed you in the previous slide, whether it's nematodes or blights, soil-borne diseases at our Gulf Coast Research and Education Center. The issue with hemp, and if you haven't heard it before in the medical marijuana side, cannabis sativa needs water, but does not like excessive water. It's not a swamp weed. Excessive rainfall will very quickly stress an actively growing cannabis sativa crop in the field. In the lower right, what you see there is a very stressed crop that actually went to the point of dying 2 weeks after the excessive rainfall we saw north of campus that first week of July back in 2019. 2 weeks before that, this was one of our best looking sites. Those biomass hemp type cultivars, grain fiber, they were looking very promising. And 8 inches of rain within a 2 week period, which is what we can see. You all saw it down there with Irma, and no doubt we'll see it again. It can be devastating to a hemp crop in a field where you do not have adequate drainage. So one of our take-home bullet points to growers has been field selection, either looking at raised beds or selecting your best well-drained fields for hemp production, whether it's for grain fiber or high cannabinoid type hemp production. Weeds. If any of you have ever hoed weeds, you'll understand and be sympathetic to this issue that without many commercially available herbicides, weed control is going to be a challenge. The use of plasticulture can mitigate some of this, but in a field setting, on the grain and fiber setting, we just don't have the weed control products yet, and we're actively looking at those products, and hopefully there'll be more options as years move forward. But establishment of hemp in the field, just like with most other agricultural commodities, is critical. You got to start out with a clean seed bed. You've got to manage those early emerging weeds in order to let the hemp get up there and get productive and shade out other types of weeds that could impact flower development or grain development. And again, I would be remiss if I didn't reinforce the importance here in the great state of Florida is in terms of understanding invasive risk. We have so many canals, so many ponds. We have Lake Okeechobee. We need to clearly understand what the potential for cannabis sativa to move off target, whether it's transmission by birds, animals, or natural movement through man-made issues, you know, whether it be wind or it's us cultivating the soil emerging the following year. As far as our Center of Invasive Non-Native Plants in the Invasiveness Center, hemp is considered to have high invasion risk. We're trying to firm that up, to substantiate that, and that work is ongoing. But we know in the northern U.S., as I touched on way earlier in this presentation, it is invasive, and we need to better understand that, or the implications could be troublesome here in the state of Florida. So what have we learned to date with the University of Florida IFAS Hemp Pilot Project? We do know that different varieties of hemp can grow well here in the state of Florida, but we've not identified a single variety or cultivar that has all the necessary characteristics, whether it's on the grain and fiber side or the high CBD, high CBG side. Some varieties remain candidates, though, for further selection and evaluation, not only in our pilot project, but for other pilot projects, because Florida A&M has a pilot project, an active one. Florida State University, believe it or not, up in Tallahassee has a pilot project. And State College of Florida has one. So there's other universities that are engaged in hemp pilot project work. And so we're bound to learn more. And this is an issue we've got to get a better handle on. The cropping system, this is where we're making progress. Understanding the importance of planting dates, matching particular cultivars with those dates to maximize optimum flowering and flower development. Understanding nutrient and irrigation needs and where we might be able to limit the application of nutrients for sustainable production, for the development of best management practices, which is what FDACS wants to see, our Florida Department of Agriculture Consumer Services, and to get a handle on these environmental and biotic challenges that could adversely affect hemp production at the field level. And again, invasiveness. Is it going to get into our natural areas, in our canals, drainage ditches? And so where we're at and where we plan to go is in part due to our additional research authorization in December of 2019. In that month, December, 10 months ago now, we went back to our board of trustees and asked to be more aggressive with state and industry funding. We wanted to qualify additional project partners, and we have, whether it's Propagators up near Apopka or Syngenta Flowers that's in the Alva area, not too far from you all. We have been qualifying industry partners that can help us further our research efforts. We have also permitted at least 18 different growers and businesses across Florida to conduct on-farm trials under the leadership of Dr. Zach Brim at our tropical REC, and that research is ongoing. And what we're trying to do is set the stage for further genetics research that may lead to hemp breeding efforts. Because like so many crops that have thrived in the state of Florida, whether it's blueberries, strawberries, or citrus, it's been because of breeding efforts led by the University of Florida that we've been able to release cultivars that are best matched for development in the state of Florida and propagation and commercialization. Giving an example of one particular on-farm trial, this is an ongoing effort that our young leader at the Hastings area, this is in the Tri-County area near Jacksonville, St. Augustine. That particular research location for IFAS is working with Ancient City Hemp, which is a new break-off company that is looking at our pilot project on-farm trial and also other selected high CBD hemp varieties this year up in that Northeast Florida location. The results are not in yet, but this was really a promising location and shows and further proves that hemp produced on plasticulture, transplanted to the field on a timely basis, can have some pretty productive growth characteristics and yield adequate flower development. So we're excited about this, and look for our results to be on our website here as we move into late fall, into winter here in 2020. Why is on-farm trial research important? Why is qualified project partner research important? Well, we want to get it right. We want to provide new knowledge and the right information for growers on the production side. What we can't control and what has come back to haunt many growers, whether they're in Tennessee or South Carolina and now the state of Florida, is where CBD isolate prices have gone. And this is rather dated information, but it really captures what's happened in the last year. And you look at this particular graph, where we've gone from January 2019 to January 2020 with CBD isolate prices as a percent per pound, and it's called a point price. It has gone from $3.50 a point down to 72 cents a point. So 80% decline. But the cost to produce that acre of high CBD hemp has remained. Those are either fixed or variable costs that have not dropped much. CBD hemp production is very labor intensive, if you've been talking about that in your class. And so those labor costs, the cost to get that crop out of the field, dried, and to the processor, they are real on a per acre basis, $12,000 to $18,000 per acre. And look at that spot price being paid as recently as January 2020, down to 72 cents per point. That's pretty remarkable and concerning. And so where can you find information and the latest results about our University of Florida hemp pilot project research effort? The best place to go is our pilot project website, and click under resources, sign up for our newsletter, look at our frequently asked questions that we try to keep updated, because this is where we're going to disseminate or transfer our new knowledge. In this COVID-19 world, the ability to do face-to-face meetings, to do our field days, we're going to be limited. Virtual field days are great. I've seen some that have been somewhat successful, but really it's going to be online resources that may make the difference for these growers, and through our IFAS extension, which we readily use to transfer our knowledge and to have them work directly with the growers. So closing thoughts, issues of concern for Florida growers should include the lack of adapted, certified, or approved hemp seed and cultivars. There is a state statute and FDAC's rules that growers in Florida can only buy certified, approved by an agency in Florida or elsewhere in the country, or pilot project approved seed or cultivars. And in the eyes of FDACS, cultivars means propagules, whether it's clones, cuttings, live plant material. Pilot projects have the ability to approve seed and cultivars, and our pilot project is in the process of approving the first set of propagules or cultivars. We're not going down the road of seed approval because that's more of an agency type effort, long established. The acronym is ASCA, and your Dr. Roca may want to visit with you about ASCA certification, but it is a process, and we think it's a better process than for us in the pilot project to try to take over and take command of. So we are approving cultivars, and that'll be for the high cannabinoids, CBD, CBG industry here in the state of Florida. So growers will have more options. So really the issue is adapted hemp cultivars and outdoor grow systems. And of course the acceptable THC, less than 0.3% total delta-9 THC by dry weight at harvest, within 15 days of harvest. So if you're advising a grower about trying to maintain a legal crop, and we tell this to growers, they should be sampling every 2 weeks after his plants, her plants begin to flower in the field. The other issue that I haven't touched on yet is that if you're growing high CBD hemp and your neighbor is growing grain and fiber hemp, they have male plants in their fields. And so medical marijuana production and high CBD hemp production are all female plants, okay? And it doesn't take much pollen drift from a grain fiber field, whether it's a half mile away or right next to your production system, to begin to affect your female plants, drastically reducing the CBD concentration in those flowers if the timing is such. So this is something that we've got to get figured out. Growers will have to work together. It's done with seed corn production up north. There's no reason it can't be done here in the state of Florida. It's all about communication. And then the last issue, which is an economic one, this is an emerging industry. We've met a lot of great people in this business, some that don't even wear shoes. But we've met a lot of characters. We've met a lot of people that, frankly, have tried to take advantage of growers that want to grow hemp here in the state of Florida. So there's a lack of a structured and stable market, delivery, supply chain system here in the state of Florida on the supply side and the delivery of flowers and grain and stalks for fiber processing and usage. So again, as you talk to those, as you learn more about it, the key is to ask questions, and growers should be seeking written contracts that are reviewed by legal counsel, their retained counsel, to make sure that when they're spending money to produce a crop like hemp, they understand the risk and the potential benefits that are involved in such production. So that's what I have to share with you today. Thank you for listening to me, and I'm not sure I can take questions in this format, but maybe I can get back with you all in the classroom, maybe down the road here before the end of the semester, and answer questions. So thank you very much, and you all have a great afternoon, and take care.
Well, Jerry, hold on a second now. I'm still here.
But the professor is still in the classroom, so we're going to
ask some questions.
Yes, sir.
So first off, thank you very much. Outstanding to give us kind of a sense of what's going on in this world of this emerging world of hemp. And yes, the focus has been on CBD, but a lot of folks are interested in the industrial side, even beyond the grain side, the fiber side, bioplastics, textiles, building materials, stuff like that. How important, in your opinion, how important is the CBD levels if that crop is going to be destined for that kind of market, where it's going to be not consumed but go into consumer products?
That is a very good question, and it's one people ask. You know, why is there such a preoccupation on 0.38% THC for a grain or fiber hemp crop, on which at the point of processing you won't find any THC, any noticeable? And you all in the class may know that literature shows that below 1% by dry weight, there's no psychoactivity of THC. So the 0.3% is kind of an arbitrary threefold protection level for DEA and USDA for that standard. And so there has been some push by associations in the emerging industry across the country to lobby and advocate for a separate role or an allowance for grain and fiber hemp production. But the reality is that would take that type of rule to be made at the USDA level, a Farm Bill level, because the Farm Bill legislation, both in 2014 and 2018, only talked about hemp as all hemp. It did not break out between high cannabinoid, grain, and fiber. And so while your question makes sense and it seems logical, all hemp has to be treated the same, which is problematic, and it may hamper some of the development of processing for hempcrete, for building products, insulation material, and the like, that could really lead to a more sustainable type infrastructure in our future communities, which is a great thing. But this is problematic, and we talk about this, the scientists talk about this, but you know, those legislators out in DC make the rules. So
you seem to be suggesting that politics and science, there's no logic between them. There's no logic in the politics. I mean, I'm surprised. I mean, I'm stunned. Never mind. Just don't go there. Anyway,
right.
let me, in summary, as you've been watching the pilot project in Florida with different varieties, are you confident that we're going to get something that's going to be commercially viable, if not this year, within, say, the next couple of years?
That is a great question, and that's what we get from growers, Dr. Roca. And we do believe that even with the current cultivar and varietal offering, there are some options for growers right now. But they're going to have to be planted in that right window. They're going to have to be managed correctly. The margin for error probably is not great. And so going back to what I said a few minutes earlier, we as an institution are going to have to seek funding, whether it's state funding, industry funding, to try to begin to plant breed our way to more adapted cultivars and varieties in this high humidity, lower day length environment in the state of Florida. I think it can be done. We've proven it with other commodities, but it's going to take research and it's going to take scientists, whether there's some of you sitting in the classroom right now that help us in this quest down the road. It can be done, but our options are somewhat limited right now in all three markets.
Okay. So you keep going back to day length, and I guess the breeding is going to be to auto flowering. So auto flowering is day neutral. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
There is a lot of excitement with the auto flowering because we can, negate the effect that we're way down here in the southeastern U.S. and we have a shorter day length. But there's some negatives associated with the auto flowering genetics, and there just hasn't been a lot of breeding with those type of genetics. We're talking just a few years. But when you talk about a crop like hybrid field corn, we've been doing breeding work at universities since the late 1930s. So, we're only in the 1940s in terms of where hemp is relative to field corn. And so we got a ways to go. But, we have more advanced plant breeding tools than we did in the 1940s on through the 70s. So we can get there quicker, but we got to get going, as I say. Yeah, we got to get going.
So when you talk about day length, just to give us a sense of significance, so you mentioned that the South China varieties match up latitudinally with our North Florida panhandle. So maybe you hit on a variety that works in, say, Jay or Quincy. Is the day length that significant between Quincy and Homestead that genetics won't work down here?
And that's a great question, and that's a good reason for having the 12 research and education centers, and this, Fritz, very well, from the Panhandle on down to Homestead, is, the environment, the soil type, the day length will vary. And we have seen some differences, some breakout differences in when varieties planted about the same time when they begin to flower. And so with a particular cultivar, you may be looking at 12.8 hours of day length to 13.1. And just that 10 or 15 minutes may make all the difference for that signal to that plant to stop vegetative growth and begin reproductive growth. And so why those plants look so good up in Quincy, probably a number of things, but certainly when they were transplanted to the field was much more optimum. But we also had some grain and fiber Chinese varieties that grew 13 to 15 foot tall at Homestead. They did really well. And so timing, planting date is critical. And so there is some adaptability. It's just for us to better understand across hundreds of cultivars what might be the most adapted and when to plant those particular cultivars.
So granted, breeding might solve a lot of these problems, but just given the daylight, the issues with day length right now, we keep hearing from Holly Bell and others that we can plant 2 crops a year, but how can that be if you got day length that being that sensitive? I mean, can we produce 2 crops a year outdoors?
Right, and so you're asking a politically tricky question, aren't you, Professor? I'm not going to contradict my Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. And the answer is yes and no. I think with auto flowering, managed correctly, now and in the future, as new cultivars emerge, yes, planting 2 crops a year is definitely doable. We've shown it, even with the day length sensitive out in the field level with supplemental lighting. We just got to figure out how to consistently do that and to make sure that when growers get into that type of multiple year production of a commodity, they understand what markets there might be available for that production. Because farmers are really good at producing themselves into no profitability. And so we can produce a lot of flowers here in the state of Florida, either in greenhouses or in field settings now and in the future. But we have to understand the economics of this production and where processors are locating. And we are seeing processors, extractors locating in the state of Florida. And that's encouraging. Some down in your part of the world there, near Fort Myers. But you got to have written contracts. You got to have some reputable people out there beyond the handshake right now, which we can't even do handshakes anymore, I guess. But you got to make sure you understand what you're producing for and get it in writing and know what you're purchasing in terms of seed or plant material. Is it legal to be grown in Florida, and will it fit our environment and the time you want to plant it?
And I guess final question, but any chance that the biomass that you produce, can that be used for other projects to look into the industrial uses for the hemp fiber, figuring out economical processes to transfer fiber into useful, commercially cost-efficient products? In other words, you got to you got to destroy your crop now. So how can one work with you or work with the growers who you're working with to say, once they harvest their flowers, say for CBD, we can use the rest of that biomass for some other research project in terms of hempcrete or bioplastics or whatever?
Right, and that's a great question. Can other universities or even private industry secure some of our production, whether it's directly from our IFAS facilities or from our permitted on-farm trial locations? And that's a question really that needs to go back to FDACS. If any part of the hemp tissue is viable, then whoever is handling it or possessing it has to be permitted. So if I was to bring you all at Florida Gulf Coast hemp plants or stalks that had any greenness to it, was still considered viable, you would have to have an active pilot project permit, which you all can actually, the way the recent legislation was. You can have a Florida Gulf Coast hemp pilot project. And so that would be possible. Now, whether you can accept dried material, that's a question that I can take back, and I'll certainly do that if you so desire, to the Department of Agriculture and see what their thoughts are. They may be very much okay with that. We'll probably have to have some type of MTA, cross-university MTA. So the legalities are all addressed. But like you say, all this is crop destruct. And we really need people looking at how to ret grain or fiber hemp, because fiber hemp has to be pre-processed before it undergoes additional processing. How it can be milled and processed and rendered in a condition where it can be made into hemp plastics and other products. So I don't think the answer is no. I think it can be done. I just don't know,
Yeah, some procedures.
without a Florida Gulf Coast pilot project permit
Yeah.
structure, how to get that accomplished.
Well, that's been a challenge for us. We've been looking at it, but there's been some issues we've had to go through. Anyway, but Jerry, you've already given us an hour, 15, 20 minutes of your time. So I really, and I know you got a busy schedule. Are you driving to South Florida now, or are you already?
No, we'll be heading down there tomorrow. We're going to move cuttings up from Alva, from Syngenta Flowers to Apopka, north of Disney World. So, yeah.
Very good. Well, have a safe trip.
I sure will. And if any students have questions, feel free to go on our website, look for my email address.
We'll get them back to you. And what I want to do is offer, again, this is recorded, so I want the students